Hey everybody, welcome to In Search for Truth. It's been a while since we have done a video, but we've been trying to come up with some good material, and some recent conversations have led to that, so we wanted to share some of the ideas that have come up. Everybody remembers Jack, and he's my teacher. We go together through the Torah and the Tanakh. I learned with him concerning the 7 laws of Noah, and we try to get as much information as we can from the Hebrew Scriptures, so that we can learn more about everything that we're supposed to be doing. And one of the subjects that was brought up in conversation was concerning, does God get affected in any form of way from our actions, from our service, from our worship, and things like that. And we found out some pretty interesting stuff. So if you would like to start it off with the question.
Well, the one thing I would like to say is that as B'nai Noah, that we have an obligation of a prohibition against idolatry. And, well, how do we accomplish that? Well, actually the way we accomplish that is having true and correct ideas about our Creator. So one of the things that we must do in order to really achieve, I guess, in some kind of perfected way, that prohibition against idolatry is to come up with true and correct ideas about our Creator. Maimonides, in his Guide for Perplexed, comes up with this same scenario, about us or anyone, by the way, that would study Torah. The first thing that we have to do to accomplish in some ways having those really true ideas and correct ideas about the Creator. And so in doing that, then that raises certain questions and issues, which I think you alluded to. In one of our studies, we came up with the question, well, what if I do something, does that affect the Creator in some way? Or if I don't do something, does that affect Him in some way? And that kind of spurred our study, which really grew from that, and we ran across some amazing information. And part of the information, of course, was from the book of Job, which commonly known to most people as the book of Job, which, at least from our understanding, is he was a non-Jew.
Okay.
And that's kind of amazing because this information comes from a conversation between him and a young man by the name of Elihu. And then we found out, as we began to study, that even Rambam, Maimonides, or Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, weighs in on the same subject in a different way, but each one of them participates, we would say, in this conversation with us in some way, adding the information to us. So the real question that I would usually ask people is, what if, hypothetically, excuse me, what if you knew that your service to God brought absolutely no pleasure to Him? Would you continue to serve Him? That's a real big question for most people, because I would say the majority of the population that are religious in some format or another, they think that what they're doing somehow brings pleasure to their Creator, which is kind of doubtful after us looking at this information. In fact, it's more than doubtful, it's almost negative. No, it's not going to happen. But, and the real follow-up question is, would you continue to do it, even though you know that it doesn't bring any pleasure to Him? On the other hand, it's the same way. What if I become this horrible, wicked person? Does that affect Him in any way whatsoever? And those are questions that are brought to the forefront in the discussion between Elihu and Job, as we know. One of the things that Job, in his conversation with his friends, he kind of gets backed up in the corner because his friends keep pushing him to the fact that he's done some huge sin. And Job, in defense of himself, actually blasphemed God, even though God doesn't hold him accountable because of the pain that he's in at the time. But he does, because Elihu brings up the point to him. He says, you said, right, in his conversation with Job, Elihu says, you said that you're more righteous than God. Now that's kind of a big statement, you know, from someone. And then he also says, he brings up another point that Eob had said in one of the conversations with his friends. And he also says, you know, well, what if I sinned? Would it have changed anything whatsoever? In other words, Eob is not going to dismiss the fact that he's righteous, that he's not kept the laws, but he can't reconcile that with the predicament that he finds himself in. And I think until we get to the last chapter of the book of Eob, where Eob actually finally gives us some glimpse of what's going on in his life. Because at the end of that chapter, if you remember the last chapter in the book of Eob, Eob makes a statement. He said, I've heard of thee with a hearing in my ear. In other words, there's been some idea about this aspect of the Creator that he's had a little knowledge of, but he's not had a complete knowledge.
Almost like a superficial idea of what he thought
Yes.
he knew about God.
Well, and more importantly, we would say it was probably not a true, correct idea about the Creator, about God. And that was the problem. I think if you go back to the very first chapter, the Satan that appears before the heavenly court is not really some type of angelic being, but it's actually Eob's own problem that he has. In other words, it's a conflicting idea about the Creator. He doesn't have correct ideas about him. And it's almost like his own incorrect ideas about the Creator that's actually brought him before the heavenly court. Right? And God sets out in his own way to correct Eob's thinking patterns about him. And so, in some sense, Eob says, well, I've heard about the hearing in my ear, which means, well, I might have had a thought, but maybe it wasn't such a good thought. Maybe it wasn't really a correct thought, you know, a really correct idea about him. But then he says, but now I see thee with mine eye. Now, what we do learn is that Eob comes from one level of understanding to a different level of understanding. All of a sudden now, he has a correct idea. And through the conversation that he has with Elihu, by the way, which is the only, you know, he's the young guy that's been sitting on the sidelines listening to the friends' conversation, because he makes a statement when he first starts. He says, you know, I thought H would have a lot of wisdom, and so he sits and listens, and he doesn't find any wisdom in what they're saying, because their accusations are still remain the same against Eob. You've done some big sin. And when Elihu, which is also the only gentleman, by the way, that is speaking from inspiration, and he claims that he's actually speaking from inspiration. So he's actually speaking in some sense in the name of Hashem. And the amazing part, by the way, that his name Elihu actually means my God is Hashem. So that's an interesting point too. And we don't really know his name, but that's just kind of a title. Some have speculated that maybe this was Yitzhak or even Yaakov during this conversation that he has with Eob. But the real issue is what we do, whether it be righteous or whether it be wickedness, can we in any way affect any change in the Creator. And that's the real issue. So for those people that think that, and somehow that they bring great pleasure to Hashem because they keep the mitzvot, you know, precisely and exactly. And the other issue is, does he owe them anything? Because they do that. Because there's a misunderstanding about that also.
Well, it's even presented in the text.
Exactly.
One of the things that happens in one of the prior conversations is the
Right.
very fact that Eob is trying to, basically he's demanding for God to give him the time of day for a trial, so to speak, because he feels that God owes him, and he wants to prove his point to God, you
Yes.
know, so to speak.
He wants his day in court.
And he does. He wants his day in court
Right.
for the sake of proving that he merits, you know, getting what he deserves, etc.
Exactly. Well, and that's his, you know, his superficial understanding of the Creator he thinks that if he is a righteous man, that he keeps the commandments exactly the way he's supposed